Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Nick Thompson. You may know me from Netflix Love is Blind, but on this podcast, we sit down with guests from all walks of life to hear their story, remove stigmas, and uncover what makes them tick. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Conversations with Nick Thompson. I'm Nick Thompson. Today's guest is an interesting one. I have Seth David Radwell coming on the show today. He is the author of this book, American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation. So not too long ago, we came out of the midterms for 2022, and I've been thinking about the results, but really about what this means for the next couple of years. The funny thing is, I feel like all these elections that we have every 2 years and consistently on the local level, and then every 4 years in the presidential, it's literally just a game of like monkey in the middle between the Democrats and the Republicans, and we're the monkey that's in the middle as a human group of citizens here in the United States, and nothing ever changes. It doesn't matter if we vote, doesn't matter if we protest. You know, it just seems like we're passing the ball back and forth, and the moment one election is over, it's now time to govern, but we don't actually get governed. Instead, we see these minuscule little tweaks, broken campaign promises, once again, not being represented. One of the interesting things that made me think of Seth was he is not looking at politics from a right-left, a liberal-conservative, a far-right, a far-left. He's actually looking at it, at our country and the problems that continue to grow and the divides that just get larger and larger and larger between all of us, and to the point where we're turning on each other, and we have turned on each other. And ultimately, his theory of the case is that if we don't make structural changes to the way that we do our politics, that we're not going to have a democracy for very long. I feel in a lot of cases our democracy is barely hanging on by a thread, if it's not gone already, just by the big money interests that are involved. The fact that we seem to always have either a divided Congress or a party in charge, like we just had with the Democrats, that always have a Kristen Sinema, always have a Joe Manchin, or someone that is able to stop any real progress and policy from coming to fruition. Meanwhile, we still have problems like immigration, homeless problems, inflation at the moment, high gas prices, people having trouble putting food on the table. And all we're doing is arguing with each other and not addressing any of these issues, and not holding our elected officials accountable to address the issues, or at least deliver on the promises that they make while they're campaigning. What I really like about Seth and his approach is he talks about the structural challenges that are actually holding us back, but he does so by taking a look at history. He looks back at the Enlightenments, as I said in the title, but he also looks back at these key moments in our country over the last almost 250 years. And he looks at the points where we were most divided and extracts these areas where we were able to come together. One of the interesting things that he and I are going to discuss is him using his business approach as an executive for most of his career before leaving to focus on speaking and being a full-time author on this topic. I was expecting to roll my eyes, because when someone says, oh, we need a business person, we need to run this country like a business, I feel like that can often leave a lot of people behind, because a business has to be profitable. A country needs to take care of its people, a community, right? But that's actually not what he says. And as I went through the book more and I've learned more about him, his approach is that we actually need to take the problem-solving methodologies that are used in business and apply those methodologies to how we work together, how we come together, how we overcome disagreements, and basically where we go from here. I think a lot about the structural issues and feel a little bit of nihilism, if I'm being honest. I think we all probably do. But one of the unique things that he does in this book is take that history and take his knowledge, but like really pinpoint some structural changes in this country, like campaign finance reform, the Electoral College, the role that the media plays, how the media is regulated, or in a lot of cases not regulated, creating an environment that isn't a duopoly between the Democrats and the Republicans. So having multiple parties and incorporating ranked choice voting so that we're no longer voting for the lesser of two evils. We're voting for a candidate that aligns with us and wants to push policy that matters to us. Taking a look at things like term limits, which I actually think he's likely changing my mind on that, which is interesting. So I'm going to dig in with that a little bit more. But I think what's really cool about this person, Seth Radwell, is he's not coming at this from a right-left perspective. He's actually using his book to look back on history and our most divided times and see how they came together back then and how we can apply that today. What I hope this does for all of you in this conversation is help you think a little bit about, first of all, like, where are you getting your media? How are you engaging on social media? Because I think it's all designed to keep us in this echo chamber where we're only hearing and being fed ideas and concepts and culture war that really just continues to feed the way we believe instead of challenge us to think differently, or challenge us to look at people as human beings instead of an issue that you have an opinion on. So where we get our media, how we consume media, and the things that we can come together on. And maybe we don't agree on what the solution is, and maybe that's where we need to have the debate. But before we do that, I think this book and this conversation does a really good job of saying, here's the structural changes that we need to make to help to save our democracy, but also to help it thrive so that we can actually come together as a people and ensure that we are being governed in a way that works for the majority of us, and make sure that we are no longer run by oligarchs, no longer run by two political parties that kick the ball back and forth and play monkey in the middle with all of us. And instead, we can build a democracy with structure that works for all of us, eliminate some of the challenges that keep us divided and keep us fighting with each other instead of building the country that we want. So let's get to this conversation, and I hope that we all learn a little something about this, and we can come together and learn some of the structural changes that we can put within our own country and make it a little bit better. So let's get to it. Today we have Seth David Radwell, who is the author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nations. He's a former business executive serving as the CEO of skincare brand you may have heard of, Proactive, CRO of Guther Renker, and holds a master's degree in public policy from Harvard. I also want to argue that you might be a historian after starting to dig into your book here. So possibilities. Thank you for coming on to the show. How are you?
I'm great, Nick. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure too. So I like to get started here before we dive into your area of expertise with some small talk, fun questions to get to know you on a different level. So
Sure.
What I want to start with is my new favorite thing to ask people is, what did you want to be when you were growing up?
Wow. It evolved over the course of my years. I think originally I was very interested in the arts, and I guess my passions were, I played hockey as a kid, and I sang. So I was interested both in sports and arts. When I was older, I thought I would like to do something more in my college years in terms of international affairs or public policy, which is what led me to get a graduate degree in public policy.
That's very cool. Isn't it interesting, like the transition from like a kid, you have like these huge aspirations of like arts and performing and all that stuff, and then as you kind of go through
Right.
and you learn how the world works, you end up figuring out where you can make a difference somewhere else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting for me is beyond that is that so I got this graduate degree in public policy, thinking I would go into government service or foreign affairs or join the State Department, and I ended up getting recruited by McKinsey and spent most of my career in business. So even there, I ended up taking turns that I didn't expect when I was younger.
So interesting. And getting recruited by McKinsey, that's a pretty big deal. So that's got to be flattering in a sense, but also not something you'd really say no to unless you had a deep affinity against it.
Well, it was a pretty interesting experience. I mean, this is many years ago, but it was quite an intense process, and I felt it was a different era. Before, I think, McKinsey is what McKinsey is today. Back then, it was quite a prestigious consulting firm. I guess it still is in many ways, but it's certainly been in a lot of controversy around McKinsey in recent years. But at that time, it gave me an opportunity to travel to different parts of the world and consult with truly top-notch companies and CEOs. And so it was a wonderful learning experience for me.
That's amazing. So I guess that's another good question I was going to ask you. What's the favorite place you've traveled?
That is terrific because I have so many. I was originally impassioned by Europe and particularly France, where I lived as a young person after college. I then had the chance to spend some time in the East. I was in Japan for a summer internship job and a couple of months thereafter in grad school. So I felt I was quite taken with Japan. Then a couple of years later, I spent a year living in Brazil for a McKinsey project, which I fell in love with.
Wow.
So I used to live in different places, which is a whole different experience than just traveling to visit there. So in terms of living, I really think France and Brazil were my favorites. In terms of traveling, I like to travel everywhere. I'm planning to go back to Brazil actually for Carnival in February this year.
Oh, cool.
And I was recently in Southeast Asia. I always love traveling in Italy, especially to different parts of Italy and France are perennial favorites. I go there pretty much every year.
Oh, that's great. Is that trip to Brazil your next trip? I guess February is not too far away.
No, yeah. Well, yes, it's my next major trip. I may go away for a couple of days, but I'm on the move a lot because I was 10 years in California and I still go out to the Los Angeles area, and then I'm now mostly based in New York.
Oh, okay. So you live then in New York, but you travel to California?
I live in New York, but I'm in California maybe once a month, and I also spend a fair amount of time in Europe.
Okay. I love
So
Europe.
I'm on the move a lot.
Yeah, that's good. I love Europe. I haven't been. I really want to go to Brazil, and it's funny that you say that because I've been thinking
Brazil's
lately,
beautiful.
yeah, about where to go. My uncle was a missionary priest in Brazil, like my entire growing up life. So he would always come back with candies and complain about how our bananas don't taste like
Wow.
bananas and stuff like that.
Well, so Brazil has so many different parts. I mean, I lived in São Paulo and spent a lot of time in Rio. But what I love in Brazil particularly is the Northeast in Bahia, and Salvador, which is the old colonial capital of Brazil, and it's very historical. So the Northeast is really very special, a part of Brazil.
That's very nice. That's good to know. When you're not writing or speaking or traveling, what's one of your favorite hobbies to decompress?
I play piano.
Oh.
Not very well, but I've started playing around 10 years ago. Music has always been a passion. As I mentioned before, when I was much younger, I used to sing and perform a bit. And then I played, even then I played reeds, mostly saxophone and clarinet. And about 10 years ago, missing music so much, I started playing piano for the first time. And, in 10 years, I've gotten reasonable. I would say I'm a beginning intermediate, but I can play pieces and I just enjoy it. And it relaxes me and is a break from what has been a very busy career in business and stress. When I spend a half an hour at the piano, and I try to do that every day,
Oh, wow.
it really makes a big difference.
That's amazing. The piano, first of all, is my favorite instrument, so I love that. And man,
Right.
maybe I should take up playing the piano or something because I don't know. Like,
Oh, you should. I would encourage it.
I want to pick up an instrument.
There's so many. Well, it takes a lot of patience, but that's part of the beauty is that it reminds you that to get good at something, it sometimes takes relentless repetition and practice and diligence, and that's kind of one of the beauties of it. I found is being able to live with that patience and frustration when things don't seem to progress, and then when you finally realize you've made progress, it's very rewarding. And by the way, I never play for people. It's like I never perform. In fact, when I have family over and I play a few things, like I always screw up. I'm better playing alone. But because I have piano performance anxiety. But anyway,
which is totally understandable if it's something that you've only played
yeah,
for yourself. I don't even know if I could play and
right.
listen to myself back, let alone play for other people, even after maybe 10 years.
But it's really, I mean, I like, when I'm in California, I usually swim every day. Where I live has a great pool. So I try to swim. In New York, I can't swim as much. So I try to walk or do other exercise. But that also is an important part of my ritual, kind of chilling out,
Yeah, I love that. I think
getting some exercise.
more people. One of my big messages when I speak about self-care or decompressing is take a walk, move your body. It's like the simplest thing. Sometimes I'll just walk around my living room. I have an open floor plan, so it's easy for me, but
Right.
just that movement kind of helps you decompress. So glad to.
Where are you based, Nick?
I'm in Chicago, so I'm sure you've been to Chicago plenty of times.
Yes,
Yeah.
sure, many times.
Yeah, so
I have close friends in Chicago, so I go occasionally.
awesome. Well, next time you're here, we'll have to grab a coffee or a drink or something.
I'd love to.
Yeah.
That would be a pleasure.
So why don't we dive in? So I learned about you through a mutual friend, and I've been working my way through your book, which I mentioned earlier, American Schism. And what I find interesting is your background and how you obviously have the degree in public policy, but your background of working in business and then coming, to speak and sort of, I don't know if you'd call yourself any kind of activist, but like really start to vocalize some of the things going on with our political discord in this country. So I want to hear about you. How did you come to this enlightened voice and message that you're sharing with the world?
Well, there was a concrete shift in direction. So for 30 years, I've been in marketing and business, running big brands. And most recently, I was CEO of Proactive. I was CEO of eScholastic, the children's publisher before that. So I've been in publishing and consumer products, a real brand builder. And I've had a wonderful career. But around 2018, I started to realize and become a bit disillusioned that as a product, I always considered myself a product of the American dream, and I came from very, background that was not a wealthy family, very modest family, and I was able to build a great career. And I started to become disillusioned in the sense that I felt like the American discourse, political discourse, had collapsed, and was reason and rational thinking and problem solving, which of course is a hallmark of business, was being crowded out by rancor and acrimony. And people ask me, did I have a cocktail party moment? I guess I realized that when my peers, fellow CEOs and business people, were afraid, they no longer wanted to discuss public sector issues, for fear of bringing on the wrath of some group, of being canceled or whatever. I felt that we were really headed for the end of our democracy, that an open society cannot really survive without Enlightenment principles. So I started doing some research into the Enlightenment and why it's so important for civilization. Anyway, to make a long story short, it was during that time that I made the shift to research, which led to the book. And my message, I guess in a nutshell, is that all Americans of every shape and size need to get involved, because what's happened is that the discourse has been crowded out by the lunatics on both sides of the aisle. And I mean the extremes. That there is, in fact, a frustrated majority of Americans who do believe that problem solving is important, that facts and truth matter, that the pursuit of truth is an important endeavor, and that believe that our Enlightenment principles, which I talk so much about in the book, are important for solving our problems today. And so that's my call to action, if you will, is for people to get back involved in this. And even if they have careers and are busy, there are small ways that we can all make a difference to ensure that we hand a democracy to our kids.
I think that's so well said. I couldn't agree more. you know, I feel like I'm a little bit like you now. I didn't know about your background so much, but like I came from modest working class. And now I'm a marketing executive, similar to where you've been. And, one of the things that
Right.
I've noticed is coming from that background and then kind of being in a different, like my day to day life is very different than how I grew up or how my family is. Some of those interactions that I have to have with them are challenging.
Yes.
And it's similar to what you're saying because you have, the extreme left, you have the extreme right, and then we all probably agree with different elements of each of those sides, but a lot of the things we agree on, are just sort of divided by the media and, our personal experiences and radical groups and radical ideology. So what would you say to someone who's, because I agree, I think everything's politics, everyone needs to come in. What would you say to those people that are like kind of in a nihilistic phase where it's like, it doesn't matter if we vote, doesn't matter if we protest, doesn't matter if we, say what we want, like nothing ever changes.
Well, of course, in American Schism, the book, I talk about this a lot. And one of the key aspects of what I would say to people is about not any political position, but about a mindset shift about how we talk to each other. And I can appreciate our perspectives and points of view on very extreme both sides of the political spectrum. But the point that I emphasize is that it's about listening and understanding and trying to not fall into what our modern media platforms push us towards, which is that what they push us towards, in fact, is looking for the rage or extreme emotion that feeds somehow our amygdala-driven passions, but is not going to be helpful at solving a problem. And so, one of the things that I think is important for your listeners to understand is that I'm a believer in that the reason why the Enlightenment was so important and why it's such a focal point of the book is that since the Enlightenment framework of this 18th century, 17th century created modern society, we've made more progress in human prosperity in the last 200 years than we had in the prior 2000. And if we're going to solve problems like the climate change and many others that we face or the next generations of world citizens face, we have to embrace those principles and not fall back into an era of unreason. And that's where I think we're headed, unfortunately.
I agree with you. And I mean, you look at climate change and scientists or not, you just got to look outside, look at the world and these massive events that are happening. And I think your eyes should be telling you that that's not something we need to argue about being true or not. But you've mentioned the Enlightenments and the Enlightenment period. You talk about them in your book. Can you sort of, explain what those were and those principles and how they would apply to today?
Well, yes, the Enlightenment, of course, was for those who don't know a lot about it, was a movement that started really originally in the 17th century by what are today called pre-Enlightenment thinkers, and then broke out in a big way in the 18th century. And it was a movement that affected every part of life. But one of the basic gists of it was about human potential and the fact that any human being had the capability of learning, of creating value through the work that they did. I mean, prior to the Enlightenment, for over 1,000 years, history was told by a couple of factors: how you were born, if you were born into a noble family or not, and who had the most power. And your lot in life was basically determined, and there was no social mobility at all. And this is true for over 1,000 years. Now, so the Enlightenment comes along, and it basically says that humans have the potential to learn and do things, create value with their minds, whereas before the only way to create value was through land, or work or labor. And so it's kind of a fundamental shift. I mean, the best examples I can use are there was a wonderful French Enlightenment endeavor in the 18th century called the Encyclopedia, which was headed by a guy named Diderot, Denis Diderot, and it was basically information that he compiled through collecting various writers that he wanted to share with people to educate them in all forms of life. And so it was that broad a movement, but it created what we today call modern society. Of course, it was in the background of the scientific revolution. So we did have, for the first time, a scientific method that became codified, which was a way to build knowledge together as a society. Anyway, so all those things happen. Now, the reason why I emphasize this so much is that the Enlightenment has over the past 50 years gotten a bad rap. What's called, and I don't want to get too philosophical on this talk, but because it's in the book and it's a little bit detailed, but the movement that sometimes is associated with postmodernism has argued that the Enlightenment was a bunch of white Europeans and what didn't matter at all. And I take the opposite point of view. I think it mattered a great deal in how we approach prosperity. And just to give you one stat, 200 years ago, life expectancy on the planet was around 31 years. And today it's over 70, obviously, everywhere, despite all our problems.
Right.
And 200 years ago, 4/5 of the world, the globe, the population, of course, was much smaller, but 4/5 of the globe lived in extreme poverty. And today, approximately 1/5 of the globe lives in that level of poverty. So while poverty, of course, is still a horrendous problem, the portion of people living in extreme poverty is 4/5 less than it was 200 years ago. Now, those advances, in my view, are attributable to this constitution of knowledge that we've built over 200 years to solve problems.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that's globally, which is good to note too.
Yes.
What with the Enlightenment and the involvement over time, how do you think it has positively or negatively or both helped us shape society and the world today?
Great question. Well, so let me talk. So one particular aspect of the Enlightenment, again, there were many, was the notion of political philosophy. Like, how should a society govern itself? That was a major question that Enlightenment thinkers across the globe, from in the West mostly, but also in other geographies, asked themselves. And there was a German Enlightenment, a French Enlightenment, a British Enlightenment, a Scottish Enlightenment, and an American Enlightenment as well. But the model that was used at that time ended up becoming very important for what today is a modern political liberal society. And it was called back then the social contract. So for some of your listeners who have read about this, they probably remember Hobbes and Locke and what's called the great social contract thinkers and philosophers in political philosophy from the 17th and 18th centuries, Rousseau. And the social contract is an important concept. The question really is how, after thousands of years of being governed by kings and wars and warlords and tribes, is there a way for us to form a modern society where humans can live in a different way together? And what are the rules of a social contract? And that's a fascinating question, because we are social beings. And if we're going to live in a society and not tear each other apart, we have to agree to some rules, some guidelines. And that's what the social contract thinkers debated. And it was during this part of the Enlightenment that there were different concepts, but there are two very discrete schools of thought about how the social contract should be structured. And this is what the book starts with. And I call the two, it's really from a lot of researches that have been done, the research that has been done in the Enlightenment, the moderate Enlightenment and the radical Enlightenment. And the difference, which I'll explain to you briefly, but again, for your listeners, I hope they are interested in take a look at the book to understand more. The difference is that the radical Enlighteners were the ones who believed that the only way a social contract could sustain is if it was structured around what today we call a representative democracy, a government of the people. Whereas the moderates of the time very much believed in what then was called an aristocratic republic, meaning that it was the responsibility of not the wealthy, but the educated to govern on behalf of everyone, because most people weren't educated. Mm-hmm. So that difference, it may sound subtle, but to paint it for you, so in the American Enlightenment, the radical enlighteners were people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. Mm-hmm. And they really understood this concept and had embraced much of what the French radical enlighteners had written about. The moderate Enlightenment, people like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, George Washington, really came more from the kind of elite aristocratic school. These were all elite people who owned land and were very well educated and developed, and had extreme belief that they had a responsibility on behalf of all society to govern. They also believed that interestingly enough, they eschewed democracy. Mm-hmm. They believed that if you give people too much power, you're going to have, they're going to be swayed by charlatans and right. people who will trick them. And so there was a very strong guardrail from the moderates against democratic republics. And people like Rousseau and famously, Voltaire and Montesquieu in Europe, but others in the States really believed that we needed a different structure of government. And so that dilemma, those two different schools of how to govern, were vying for prominence when this country was formed in the 18th century. And of course,
can I sum that up real quick? So
sure.
Basically, what you're saying is there's the educated, the wealthy, the elites, and then there's the kind of the people, and they're arguing about who should be the one that build the construct of society. Right. Okay.
Right. And how it should be run. Now,
sounds familiar.
One other key. Yeah, right. Well, this is so the whole premise of the book is that if we really want to understand why things are so difficult today, why we're in such trouble, there are secrets in history. Mm-hmm. This is not new. We've had these tensions vying in our republic since the beginning, even before, and whether it was through the lens of slavery or throwing Native Americans off their land, and whatever the construct was, even before we were a country, the question of how to govern ourselves and who gets a seat at the table, who counts, whose voice counts, is a fundamental question regarding how our social contract works. And it's as relevant today as it was back across our history. So what American Schism, the book, does is it lays out a framework, and then it traces through 5 periods of our history using that framework up until today to use it as an analysis tool for how we can, what are the different, how do we move forward? What are the constructive ways to approach differences in society, and what are the counterproductive ways, which I argue we're in right now, a very counterproductive
could not agree more.
Period. And how do we use the secret sauce that we found over our history to make great progress? And so the third part of the book, after this historical journey, lays out a plan for how to move forward. So it's very much a concrete roadmap. And while that sounds bold, I believe it works at trying to point to steps that we can all take to save our republic.
I actually had a couple parts in your step forward that I thought were really noteworthy. And one of the things that I just want to say for the audience, whether they read it, they don't, my audience is actually very mixed. And I think one of the cool things about this show is that I can talk to anyone and come to ideas and not culture war stuff, right? So what I think is so interesting that you talk about, all of your steps forward, they are all based in policy. They're not based in he said, she said, let me tell you what you can and can't do in society. They're all policy based. So what I think is so interesting about your book and your whole message is when we take the emotion in a sense, out of this and keep it to the policy, that's how I vote. That's actually how you should be voting on the local level, all the way up through the presidency, right? But what are a handful of these, maybe few of these ways forward that you have laid out in your book and that you believe can really help us, get more policy focused and less emotionally focused?
Well, so let me. I think that's a great question, and it's a good place to move next in our discussion. One of the examples that I think is illustrative is the whole question and area of immigration, and here's what I mean. There are so many. Our immigration system is completely broken, and there are so many aspects to how immigration has been treated historically in our country. At times when we've needed workers and labor, it's been extremely, open. At other times we've been very, it's been very closed, and we've been somewhat xenophobic in our policy. But here's the thing. I think that we had around 13 years ago, 11 years ago, there was a very serious effort that was done by what was called the Gang of Eight, which was a bipartisan effort in Congress to lay out a comprehensive structure for immigration reform. And it was quite detailed. It proposed to solve many of the myriad issues associated with both protecting our borders and having a reasonable immigration policy. And I talk about this in the book. Now, this proposal, by the way, made many on the two extremes angry. Like, it had a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. So people on the right were very worried about it. On the left, it had things like quotas. They weren't called quotas, but there were limits to immigration, and some on the left thought that was not right. So both sides were not happy, but it was a set of compromises. And it passed the Senate, and for a couple of political conundrums at the time, Boehner never brought it to the House.
This was bipartisan in the Senate, right?
Bipartisan, completely. It had tons of compromises. It was not perfect, but it laid out we would have really reformed the whole system. With a point scoring system about how to make sure immigration was balanced, and how it both had amnesty ideas, like help for people who needed it, but also recognizing that we couldn't just open our borders. Right. It was kind of a balanced approach. So it would have passed had it been brought up in the House. It didn't pass, and then now 11 years later, we've been screaming about open borders and building walls, and we're much further away from a solution. Yeah, we haven't solved any of the problems. We've
created
even more
more.
Broken.
Yeah, we've created more.
Right. That's right. So that's the notion that sometimes if you can, like when we created the Constitution after the Revolutionary War, which is a very instructive period, if we can realize that of course we have differences, but we need to come together and forge solutions, because otherwise we just leave problems fester.
Right.
And so I think immigration is a good example. So as a consequence, my approach in the book is that there are structural changes that we need and mindset changes that we need to be able to make good policy decisions, to be able to solve problems. And that unless we start making some of those changes, we're going to do what we've done in immigration, like screaming at each other with nothing getting solved.
Well, and
that's it's very counterproductive.
It's very counterproductive, and that's like the media again coming in too and not helping the situation. I mean, I'm sure policy-wise, there are some people on the radical left that are all for open borders, but those people are not really represented as lawmakers. I can't think of a single Democrat that's for open borders. And then I think on the extreme right, you have just the other side, and then we're screaming at each other about these things, and it's like that's not even. But we all agree we need an immigration policy, so why don't we just start there and figure out what we want that to look like?
Right. Exactly. First of all, the country was built by immigrants. On the second, so immigrants have allowed us to become a diverse, incredibly rich society that solves problems in more innovatively than anyone else on the planet. So it's been the key of our success. At the same time, what is open borders means basically like you're being invaded. You're not letting anyone come in. That's like, what does that mean, open borders? So of course we need, the world the way it's constructed today. We need a reasonable immigration policy, and for humanitarian reasons, I do believe that immigration policy needs to take into account suffering of people in political peril. But at the same time, it needs to make sure that the 300 million, almost 300 million Americans here have an ability to have wonderfully prosperous lives and succeed. So it's a balance, and this is becoming increasingly difficult across the globe in open societies because of the pressure from geographies south or other parts of the globe, whether it's in the Middle East and it's something that we all have to wrestle with. I think one of the great examples is what happened in Germany with Merkel's policy of being somewhat tolerant to allowing immigrants from other parts of the world, troubled parts of the world, to enter Germany, and how Germany dealt with that over the past 10 years. And it's
That's
still
a great point. And this is something I was actually talking about this with my friend yesterday. We have immigration challenges now, and they are only just beginning because with climate change, there is, even here in the U.S., like the Midwest, where I am right now, like there's going to be, we can't really call it immigration, but there's going to be migration from parts of our country into the Midwest because of climate change, not to mention the places in the Middle East that, what do they say, in 20 years, you're not going to be able to have human beings living there because it's going to be too hot. Where are they going to go?
Right.
So we have to come up with reasonable and adaptable immigration policies that are going to your point, protect our country, but also have that humanitarian aspect to it as well. And I think it's one of the most important things that we're going to need to figure out sooner rather than later.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and these are complex issues, and they need to be solved through reasonable problem solving as opposed to only. Now, I do point out in the book that throughout our history, the political landscape has been characterized both by rational thinking and emotion. It always is. It's never, but that those are in balance. That today the emotions gotten out of whack. It's overwhelmed. It's crowded out rational thinking. And the concept is you've got to have a bit of both. Of course, passions and principles and values which drive emotions are very important. I'm not saying we shouldn't have those, but they need to be balanced by rational thinking.
Right, that's exactly it. What do you think is so I agree with you. Like, I look around and I see, even if you think back to like the presidential debates in 2020, even probably more so in 2016, it was all culture war, all emotion, all he said, she said. And I know, like, if you get involved on a local level, you can actually make change because there are people governing your neighborhood, there's people governing your district, there's people governing your city, your state. You can get involved and make like those types of change. But when you look at, the media, you look at like the big picture of the country, it's all emotion. Like, there is no rational behavior, or at least it's like 90%, 90-10. Like, what do you think's causing that? What do you think is the main?
So this is discussed in the book in some detail. I think there's no question that our media models today tend to incentivize rage and whoever screams the loudest. So it's that clickbait technology. What it does is it creates incentives for getting the most attention, not for who uses the most facts or who does the most careful research. So the incentive system in media has to change, and that's one of the structural changes I talk about. And I don't mean by that, by the way, that government should take over media. That's not that.
That's
We're a
a
free
whole
society.
different problem we would have.
Yeah. Right. What's happening today with Twitter is fascinating to me. This whole pseudo debate about free speech, which I won't use bad terms, but it's BS to me. The whole thing is not really an honest debate.
No, it's not.
Because of course, free speech matters. But at the same time, free speech as a right in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, it has to be balanced by other rights.
Yes.
The right to not hurt other people.
Hate speech.
Or kill them. Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole, but rights are often in conflict. They need to be balanced. Anyway, the point being is that the media, as I was saying, has realized that it can make a lot of money by incentivizing, but by using the incentives that currently exist, which are to get attention. And as a consequence, there is really little news outlets anymore. What's on cable TV today is really not news. They really are opinion shows.
Disguised as news shows. Disguised as news shows.
Disguised. Right.
And that's both sides.
So what do we do about it? Well, right. So there is a role for regulation because in a capitalist system, one of the roles of government is to make sure that information, which is a public good, is promulgated. Good information is fundamental for a capitalist system to work in modern society. So therefore, the government's not going to take over media, but we have to change the incentive system. And this all goes back to, there used to be during the Reagan era, there was the fairness doctrine on the public airways, which Reagan in his administration, because he was so anti-government, he eliminated. But the fairness doctrine made sure that the networks at the time were required to have a range of political views on their news shows, and this was something that was carefully measured and monitored, so that news shows were required to do so. And of course, that fairness doctrine was eliminated in the 80s. And since then, we've had, in my view, a degradation of the flow of accurate information. Now, when I say it's not the government's role is to create incentives, I believe, because we're such an innovative society, we need great Silicon Valley or other innovators to come up with new models. Imagine a version of Facebook or Twitter where every account is verified. When in our society, we recognize for certain things you need authentication. Mm-hmm. Like if you want to drive, you need to get a driver's license because it's too dangerous for anyone to. Imagine a social platform that was created by entrepreneurs where every profile was verified as a real person and not a bot in Russia or some other, crazy. So there are ways to do these things. And imagine, by the way, that where the algorithms to promote information were based on veracity and not rage. I mean, there are certainly ideas and concepts that are being thought about, and I'm convinced that we can evolve to a better media platform. Yeah. And I think it will take some government regulation. I don't think we should allow news programs to be called news unless they really are news. Right. And so anyway, so the book talks about this in some detail. But that's one of the structural changes I think we have to make. Other ones are. Can I comment on
the news real quick? So this is my free speech is my number one thing. Having studied journalism, being editor-in-chief of my college newspaper, having to deal with censorship, but also self-censorship and all of those things. We have, for the people that don't know, 6 major media companies that own all of the news, and they're profit-driven. And to your point, they are. I argue now that it's not even clickbait. People don't even click; they just read the headline as they scroll and they move on. So they're not even clicking anymore. So the algorithms on social media also feed the beast of this divide, because the algorithms are designed to feed you more and more of the same. And Facebook literally has you labeled by a political standing, whether you're, I forget exactly what they are, but it's like very conservative, moderate, liberal, very liberal, something to that extent. And you can go see that in your profile. And that's how they feed you information to keep you in an echo chamber of hate and anger. Right. And so when you've got 6 media companies and their opinions coming down at you, and then you've got social media feeding you similar things to what you hear every day, you're just in an echo chamber, and it's constant negativity and hate for someone else who's a fellow human being. And that's, to your point, to me, the main issue with
your point, though. Correct. But you said something very important, which people, these media companies that you talk about will make more money if they get you to read their stuff more. Yeah. So they feed you ideas that they know you believe in because you'll have a better chance, and that are outrageous often, because you have a better chance of clicking or reading or staying with that platform and getting more ad exposure. So it's absolutely this echo chamber problem, and but I want to point out also, we're talking about the media supply side. As I discuss in American Schism, the book, there's the demand side, and what I mean by that is that, for many decades, we had a real priority given in our education system to civic education, and to some degree, civic education, the whole framework of it, has been crowded out by STEM, science, technology, math, which are extremely important. But as a consequence, when I say demand side, what I mean is that citizens to be in an open, democratic, liberal society need the skills to be able to evaluate data, to make an argument, to understand when something is totally ridiculous, or to question and be curious.
Nobody questions.
So that's the demand side that we've also abandoned. So what's so interesting to me about this, Nick, is that during the French Revolution, there was a phase before the Reign of Terror when the radical Enlighteners were in charge. And the 1792 French Constitution, unlike our Constitution, specified that if they were going to have a new society, the state's responsibility was to ensure that all citizens could be educated in civic affairs. That you had a responsibility as a citizen to use your voice and how to use it and what it required. And that's also true. I believe a democratic republic requires an educated citizenry. And by the way, ironically, that's what the moderates were so afraid of. They believed that because people could not be they didn't have as much faith in the average human being as did the radicals, who believed that everybody could have a voice.
Right. And I think that's so interesting, because I kind of
education part is really important.
I totally agree. And I don't even think they teach civics anymore at all. I could be wrong. I don't think it's taught in schools anymore. If it is, it's like a very watered down version.
Yeah, and it's not even only like having a civics class. It's like when we went to school as kids, I'm older than you, we used to have like debate groups and like evaluating information in every aspect of the curriculum, social studies, or it was an important aspect of learning to think for yourself and being curious. And contrast that to what happens in the echo chambers you just pointed out or illustrated. The opposite happens. There's no curiosity about really wanting to find out what's true. Yeah. It's almost as if the analogy I discuss in the book is that we all have, as human beings, part of our ancestral DNA, which served us very well for thousands of years, was based on making sure we could align with an in-group and demonize an out-group. This tribal behavior. It's part of our amygdalas. It's what forms our genetic makeup. And what we've done in modern societies, we have found ways to sublimate it productively, which is why it feels so good to go to a sports game and root for your team. Whether it was France or Argentina, sports is a very natural way for those emotions, which is part of who we are, but to come out and be aired, which is important. One of the worst places to do that is in the political arena. I mean, we're treating our public policy as if we're watching a wrestling match, and those two things don't mix. They're not good combination. Of course, we want to be in an in-group. We want to exercise our right to tribal behavior. That's fine. Join a sports team, but recognize that in citizenry, in the public arena, we need to be more curious and more thoughtful, and once again balance the primitive emotions with problem solving and thinking. Now, one of the reasons why I think the book has become a success, and it's won quite a few awards, and I've been speaking a lot about it, is because as a business person, I approach this with a business mindset that served me well in my career in business, as we discussed earlier, which is about problem solving. As I used to say to many of my marketing teams over the years, the data, the facts matter. I used to, the pithy expression I used was whenever they would make an argument or presentation, I would say, in God we trust, everyone else has to bring the data. And that is, I believe that very much is data matters. And if you want to make a case, the facts matter. And anyway, so that's one of the principles that I think is laid out repeatedly through the book. And when it comes to these structural changes, as important as they are, the mindset changes, like having a focus again on civic education, like being able to listen in a different way.
Yes.
That's the kind of work I do now, is with groups that are very much promoting those mindset changes. Groups like Braver Angels, which is trying to get people all across the country from different perspectives to talk to each other in a new way. Or groups like No Labels. It's rejecting the current way we talk about issues and trying to find a new, more productive discussion.
And I heard you talk on a different podcast about these organizations and how they are nonpartisan. And as
Yes.
I found myself, over the years working in campaigns specifically, you really notice, again, it's like you're in the echo chamber, and I don't think I think you should volunteer for a candidate if they speak to you. I think that's a very important part of our democracy. But all in all, like I feel like we have to also understand that there's other people equally activated on the other side. And you're still having these same echo chambers, and we're not talking to each other. Where if you're in a bipartisan group, you're having a bipartisan conversation, or a nonpartisan, let's say, because I don't even think we should have bipartisanship. But that's where you're going to really meet on specific issues and specific causes that you can align with someone on. Where you may not agree on how to do it, but you might agree it's an issue, like immigration. I don't think anyone in this country would say immigration's fine as is, but we can build that compromise. Right, exactly. So what are some of the other changes? I specifically love how you talk about ranked choice voting. I'm not as good as explaining it as you are, as I've heard you and seen you explain it. So can you talk about ranked choice voting, explain what it is and why you think it's important for us to better educate people and implement that here in the country? Because I know it is in local areas sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. So remember before, Nick, you talked about how the media is driven by 6 companies that control the whole landscape, almost like an oligopoly. Well, I would argue our political system is based on a duopoly, which is the Republican and Democratic parties have a lock. And that's a problem because they've become driven only by raising money. I mean, much more time is spent by elected officials today of both parties raising money than in solving problems. That's how they spend their time, raising money to get reelected. So the reason why ranked choice voting is so important is in our current system, it promulgates, it allows the continuation of the power by these two parties. Normally in an election in the U.S., a third party candidate is a spoiler. Mm-hmm. It's someone who comes in and takes a few votes from one and allows the election to tip. But the beauty of ranked choice voting is it's a system that's fairly simple. And it's much more reflective of voters' desires. The way it works is, as opposed to having 2 candidates with maybe a third spoiler, you can have 5 or 6 candidates. You have many more ideas in the problem-solving space. And the way it works is that people rank their choices so that if your first choice doesn't get in the top, let's say, couple, that your second choice then counts. So you get to vote again. Your battle's not thrown out. Let's say there are 5 candidates, Nick, running in some election, and we hear a great set of ideas from 5 different candidates, and then we rank them, and the person I rank comes in 5th. Mm-hmm. Well, normally that person's going to then my ballot no longer would count in a regular voting system. But now in ranked choice voting, since that person came in 5th, my second choice counts.
Becomes your first choice.
And my vote gets allocated to that second person. So to make a long story short, it's a system by which even if your first choice gets thrown out because not enough people, they were last, mm-hmm. your ballot, your consideration is still considered because you have a second choice.
And then you're not stuck.
And the votes get reallocated.
Exactly. And then you're not voting lesser of two evils, which has led us to this mess that we're in now, because 70% of the country.
It's a very simple system.
Yeah. 70% of the country, I think, or 69% claims that they're independent, which means they don't ally Democrat or Republican. But then when it's time to vote, they don't have any other choice. And as someone who has volunteered for third parties, both locally and on the federal scale, like, there's a lot of ideas that never get the time of day because of the duopoly you mentioned. And I think that it would actually do a lot of work to bring our country together. And even the infighting, I mean, as again, like, I have voted third party, and you get shamed, you get yelled at, you get blamed, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute. At what point am I not allowed to vote with the person who represents me from a policy level? And we just don't even get that discord. And then they even own the debates. I mean, in 2016, I was trying to get Jill Stein on the debate stage, and she needed 15% of in the polls in order to get in the debate. I mean, she's like probably our third or fourth main party's presidential candidate, and she's not allowed to join the debate because the Republicans and the Democrats have made the rules.
Ranked choice voting is working at the local level. It happens. It's being adopted more and more in local elections, and I think it is very feasible that we could move towards a new system gradually over time. And that's why I do work with organizations, and again, nonpartisan, but organizations that fight for these changes. There are three great examples I could point out. One is ranked choice voting. Another one is campaign finance reform, because I believe that the notion of money in politics has gotten out of control, and I can talk more about that. I do in the book.
Please do.
And a third is term limits. I think that when the Republic was founded, both schools of Enlightenment didn't think that politicians should be career politicians; they should serve forever. There was the idea of doing service and moving on. And as I speak about in the book, there is a wonderful aspect of renewal that relates to not being in the same job your whole life. And so I believe term limits is something that we should really be considering for elected office and for Supreme Court justices as well. And I make the case of why in the book.
I think, it's funny because I go back and forth on term limits, and I feel like the way you talk about it makes sense to me. The only challenge I have, and I'm curious your take on this, is we have this revolving door between our government and big business and lobbying, where even if you lose, like, you can go lobby, you can make a whole bunch of money, you can go back and sit on the board of a giant corporation who's then has lobbyists influencing. So how do we stop that? Like, because I feel like if we do term limits,
that speaks more to that speaks more to campaign finance reform to me. I mean, the notion that a corporation, which is frankly, a corporation is a legal entity created for tax and liability structure. The notion that a corporation has the same rights of free speech protected in the Constitution as a person is ludicrous.
It's ludicrous. That's the word I was going to use.
It's completely ludicrous. And so, we have this system that's evolved by which the money machines around politics are crazy. And that kind of affects what you're talking about in terms of, not that lobbying is entirely related to the campaign finance laws, but it partially is. And we certainly have allowed money to dominate politics in a way that is inconceivable to me. So now there are ways to solve this as well. And I say I've talked about this at various times in podcasts and things, and I also write about it. One of the ways to do it is if we can't find a way to have more truth in political advertising, because we protect it in the name of free speech, then we should ban political advertising except in print, in long form. Because so I'll give you an analogy for your listeners. I ran the biggest acne brand in the world, Proactive, and we would spend around, let's say, $3 or $4 million a week on advertising. Every ad that we created, whether it was for the TV or or internet, it was regulated by two government bodies, the FDA for claims on acne and the FTC for marketing claims. And that's because the government has a role to make sure that we weren't lying.
Right.
But yet in political advertising, you can say whatever you want. And there's an inability to say that's false because it is the most protected form of speech according to the First Amendment. And while I understand that argument, there's something wrong. So if we can't agree to guidelines on how to ensure political advertising bears some relation to a world of truth, then we should ban it and go back to public funding of elections or there are ways, we don't have cigarette commercials on TV because it's so toxic. Cigarettes are so toxic. So why should we have campaign ads on TV? I mean, again, this is an important issue to discuss, and I recognize the difficulties of banning political advertising, but at the same time, the system has become entirely broken.
It's like we're too far gone to do anything reasonable about it. I mean, I like publicly funded elections. I feel like there's a possibility to do political advertising, but like you got to put a cap on it, on spend, or it's public and like you have the publicly regulated debates. Maybe right. We as people vote on who moderates those debates because I feel like they're obviously also, they go in there with an agenda. If CNN's hosting a debate or a town hall, they go in with their agenda. So I feel like you're right with the public funded or at least banning political ads until we can figure out a better way to do it, because they're toxic and they're, again, just feeding these narratives that they want to say whether there's facts involved or not.
And we've created a beast because more and more money keeps going. Every cycle, it seems like we're spending more on a Senate campaign, or it's just more money is going into it, and which makes anyway, it exacerbates the problem.
Yeah. Well, and it just, the election cycle just never stops. I mean, we've right. got Trump announced a month ago or so, and so he's going to campaign for over 2 years, like. Oh my, the money that's being spent on that. It's just insane. So I'm with you. I completely agree on that. So I want to ask you, just because we've jumped before in between,
right.
What are your top key bullet points of that you outline in detail in the book? I think it's 5 of these massive changes that we should be, or structural changes that we should be working towards.
Well, so we've spoken about a few of them. I believe that things like campaign finance reform and term limits and ranked choice voting are 3. I think we fundamentally need to change aspects of the structural federal government, meaning the Electoral College is a vestige of an era from another time, which is no longer it's no longer helpful, and it needs to be changed. It is so undemocratic, and it's also arbitrary. I mean, the fact that the Dakotas were made 2 separate states for a purely political reason, and so North and South Dakota, and I have nothing against Dakotans, by the way, they have 4 senators. And a state that has 35 times more GDP and 40 times more people, California, has 2 senators, and as a consequence has fewer electoral votes. That just doesn't make sense. I don't believe that we need to go and abandon states, but we need to have a restructure of things like the proportionality in the House and in the Senate. Now, there's a lot's been written about this, and once again, there are compromises that can be made. It seems that in today's political debate being so vitriolic, we can never change this kind of stuff.
I know.
But I believe that there are ways we can, and I talk about them more in the book.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and you really hit all of the key things that sort of circulate with one another to keep us sort of in this mess, and that's what I appreciate about your message. I have to ask you this because I'm curious. So you come from your working class background, and then you did the big corporation thing. What do your peers think about your message? Because it works for so many of those big businesses.
Well, one of my audiences for the book are people in who may be in the private sector as leaders or business people, but still make up part of what I call the frustrated majority, meaning that they recognize that the extremes are not helpful, but they feel like they don't have a voice. They can't wrestle the gavel back. So I'm trying to help people in the private sector, try to play a role at taking the gavel back and having a voice and not being afraid to recognize that reason does matter and problem solving does matter. And so my message of fight unreason with reason at every turn is part of what I'm particularly asking my former peers, fellow CEOs or C-level people in business, to figure out how they can make a difference in that area.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about that too is it would go a long way to restoring faith that some people have lost in organizations, specifically the larger ones too. If they actually, instead of throwing up a diversity and inclusion group, they actually brought these types of practices and had these uncomfortable conversations so we can start making progress.
Yeah, it's hard. It's tricky because because of these extremes we've been talking about, everything that is said or discussed can be used kind of against you. We have this vindictive policy today of canceling, which makes people loath to speak out. And so on one hand, we have certain parts of the populace screaming, and then we have other parts that are afraid, like mice, afraid to squeak. And so that's why the frustrated majority is frustrated and exhausted, because they don't know how to make a difference.
Right. And then the voice the squeaky wheel, right? The loudest voice gets heard, and then the people who don't speak become the silent majority, and then the divide continues. So, well, this is, I think, like I said, I think what you're doing is it's refreshing. And I think you have like a pragmatic approach to, the top challenges we're facing. So I thank you for doing that, because I sometimes, from an activist perspective, I'm like, I don't even know where to start anymore. Like, I don't even, after the last couple of years, it's like, I don't even know anymore. So I started this podcast to have conversations like this and around other topics. And, I just try to be able to talk to everyone and listen. And I think if we listen a little more, we can maybe make progress. Because I do think fundamentally same with immigration, we can all look at it and say, we have a problem. So let's just start there. We can all agree on that. And I think, I thank you for all that. So is there anything that you want to ask me? We'll head into that area, and I'll give you an opportunity to ask me any questions.
Well, I would love your listeners to check out American Schism, and they certainly, if they have questions, on my website, SethDavidRadwell.com, they can reach me. And I'm part of what I'm trying to do is expand the conversation. So I love hearing from readers and listeners. So I would ask your listeners to engage, and I think the work you're doing is part of the solution, Nick. I think talking about these things in a longer format than just a commercial makes sense, and they're tough issues, and we need to have a reasonable discussion around them, and that's part of what Conversations with Nick Thompson is adding to. So thank you for your work on that area.
Absolutely. And we'll put links to everything in the show notes too, for those of you interested. And I highly recommend the book as well. So
thank you. Thank you. This has been really fun. Keep up the good work and have a wonderful holiday season.
Is there anything you wanted to ask me in a Ask Me Anything part?
Well, I'd love to know a little bit more about what types of guests you love having on your show, and how you're trying to expand it and grow the readership.
Yeah, absolutely.
The listenership, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started this podcast, as I kind of alluded to, because I feel like we can't talk to each other anymore. And there's so many stigmatizing topics. So I have guests on about mental health, about overall health, wellness, physical fitness. I have guests around news and politics. And across the board, I have guests on that are really doing good work and doing good things to help remove stigmas around various topics. And so, when it comes to these types of topics, I like to just, elevate conversation that you're not getting when you listen to the news from CNN or Fox or MSNBC, or you read the New York Times. Like, I feel like more and more people are interested in these long form types of conversation as well. And it really gives me an opportunity to humanize my guests as well, so that you can see, hey, we're all kind of just in this together, and we all got to kind of learn to live with these topics. And so let's just talk through them and let's humanize it. So it's no longer the radical left thinks that we need open borders. It's like, or that the right thinks we need a wall. It's like, well, we all think there's an immigration problem. Why can't we just talk about that and come up with solutions that work for both of us?
Right, exactly. I couldn't agree more. Well, again, thanks for that work and keep it up. I'll try to listen to more of your episodes. I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple that came out in the last month or so that might interest you. But I want to thank you again for coming on. Can you tell people where to find you? We'll get the book link. Where can they find you on social media?
So my website is... Sure. So the book is available on Amazon, American Schism, and they can find me on social media on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. I also have my own blog, which they can find out more about on SethDavidRadwell.com, and they can write to me there. And I would love, again, as I mentioned, to hear from people. So thank you so much for the time, and please let me know, Nick, when this will air, so I can also share it with my communities. I have a lot of followers in my social media, and I will certainly promote the link when this podcast gets to be aired.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Conversations with Nick Thompson. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to follow us and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Links can be found in the description below, and we can't wait to see you next time.